Hello, and welcome to another week of the Storied Arcs podcast. I am your co-host, Mike.
And I'm your co-host, Alex.
And today we are finishing Time Before Time. I suspect everyone tuning in is eager to discuss the ending, as am I, although we have a couple things to talk about first. And this is a strange series in that do you call the ending the final issue, which is the last issue of the second to last volume, or do you call the ending now the end of Trade 6, which was actually Will Morris's?
It's a strange setup because you're right. The narrative ends in issue 28. The issue 29, which is the final publication issue, is effectively a coda. And then if you're reading it in trade, you have the 6 one-shots that publication-wise have already been out by the time you got to volume 5, but those become the last things you read. So it is a little strange. I think we'll talk about that too. But you know, so because of all those different things, there's a bunch of artists here to mention and kind of highlight. We want to, make sure to give everyone their proper credit. So, the final arc, what we'll call that, the final actual arc, issues 25 to 28, those were drawn by a French artist named, I think it's Joffo. That's what I'm going with. I'm going with Joffo there. He's a French artist. He's done a lot of mostly Marvel work, including like some web comics, like in the Infinity, like the Infinite Scroll comics, and some kind of spot DC work there. It's kind of, people kind of know him from. Joe Palmer, the series co-creator, comes back for 29 to do that last, like what really is a coda to the whole story. That is kind of the final button. He comes back for one more issue there. And then we jump into volume 6, which again is issues 6, 12, 18, and 24. Issue 6 was drawn by Shelby himself. Again, all these are co-written by both McConville and Shelby, but Declan draws 6, and 24 was drawn by Will Morris, who, if you want more info on Will Morris, scroll on back in your feed to when we talked about his book Gospel. We mentioned in that issue, in that episode, kind of in the limited work he had done, one of the main things he had done was an issue of Time Before Time. And so now we've come full circle again and mentioned it. So Will Morris is 24. In between, we had issues 12 and issue 18. Issue 12 is drawn by PJ Holden, who is a Northern Irish artist who, much like Roy McConville and Joe Palmer, a lot of the work done over in the UK, a lot of work with 2000 AD and Judge Dredd, like seemingly everyone, anyone who works in comics over in the UK has, 2000 AD and or Judge Dredd somewhere on their CV.
Sure.
It's just how it works. Not a lot of US based work. The one, I think, major work of note that's relevant to this book is he worked with Declan Shalvey on a James Bond issue, a one-shot for Dynamite. It's called James Bond 007 M. It's a one-shot based on M that's within the continuity of the Dynamite James Bond universe, which is like loose continuity across a bunch of books there, but it's most relevant probably to Time Before Time because it's it's an instance where one of the co-creators worked with PJ Holden. And finally, there's issue 18. Lauren Knight, who is a Scottish artist, again, noticing a trend here in terms of the people that they generally work with. Although I think they missed Wales. I guess they had.
There have been 30 issues.
England,
yeah,
Scotland, Ireland, Northern Ireland. They've worked their way through all of the British Isles minus Wales. But Lauren Knight came in for issue 18. Her most notable work was probably a book with Chrissy Williams over at Image called Golden Rage, which I have not read. I've seen pages from. The elevator pitch is Battle Royale meets Golden Girls. So it's kind of an interesting high concept book. She's also done some work on some licensed titles like Buffy and Star Trek and things like that. But again, a lot of the creatives that this team worked with, not as super well known in the US. Most of their work done over in the UK. So it kind of becomes, Time Before Time kind of becomes an interesting spotlight on some artists that get much more work in their homeland and maybe a little less visible here in the US. with the exception of Declan himself, which is probably part of the reason. Like he's the biggest name on the book to U.S. readers, to the U.S. audience, the market here, and so I think his name carries a lot of weight. And by reading this book, you're exposed to a lot of different other writers, creators, and collaborators, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, very cool. And yeah, I can't remember if in my discussion with Will Morris I asked him how he got that. I think I just went straight to asking him about like the content, the process of jumping in for one issue to someone else's ongoing book. But as has been well documented by this podcast, I had not been keeping tabs of the single issues that late into the series.
Yeah.
So I don't think I would have picked up on the pattern that what the one he did would have been a one shot.
Yeah.
You know, in the universe rather than, you know, because it would be weird if he just took one in the middle of a story arc. Not unheard of, but weird.
No.
And I will say it was really nice to see his art again.
Yeah, it was cool. It was cool. And I think there's that the idea of the guest artist for those one shots obviously makes a ton of sense. You know, you bring someone in, different energy, different feel, different storytelling mindset. It is just it's curious and interesting that they, for whatever reason, decided to do that for their story arcs all the way through. You know, every time there was a new arc, they had a new artist in. Combine that with these kind of one-shot interstitials. It makes for the kind of variety you see that's incredibly rare for a creator-owned book.
Yeah,
because you just don't get those rotating guest artists in. They're not set up to function like that typically. So that it does set time before time apart from kind of other creator-owned projects when that, you know, you have over half the issues drawn by not the co-creators, which is interesting.
Yeah. It's very strange, and I will say some of the characters change noticeably from issue to issue.
Yeah, I mean, character design does, but I mean, that
it's not unrecognizable, but you do notice like, oh, that's Tetsuo here. You know, but that his look changes a lot.
Well, Tatsuo does, yeah, because he ages and he gets sick and things of that. So, you know, there's some excuse there. But I mean, for most of the characters
Kevin's pretty consistent.
Yeah, Kevin's consistent. Obviously, we'll get into it. The Nadia we see in volume 5 is also at this point older, you know, change her hairstyle, things like that. But I think it's very intentional that most of the people that we see in the syndicate, like Marston, Fang, all of them, they're always just the same, you know, like they kind of have a standard getup. So no matter who the artist is, you can, even if you don't remember their names, you know, oh, that's that person. That's the person in charge. That's the second in command, yada, 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 things like that.
Yeah. Shall we jump to the story?
Sure. Yeah. So okay. What are your thoughts on the ending, which what we'll call the ending of the main narrative? So the ending we get in volume.
Oh, in 29. 5. Okay.
Well,
issue
really 28, and we'll jump to 29 later. Because the narrative ends in 28. So let's go with let's start there. Let's try to frame it that way. So
okay,
25 to 28. The actual ending of the story, which the final page of that is Kevin and Nadia coming around the time machine pod and seeing Tatsuo's feet, because we know Tatsuo has finally passed. So, what did you think of how the mainline story we've been following? How did that narrative end for you?
I think if it ended at issue 28, we wouldn't be covering this book on this podcast. I think it was a fine ending. But there were, you know, it was like all the nothing burger of like the syndicate leadership and jockeying and stuff like that.
There's a lot of that
came to a head at this. And it's like, that's not what this story has been about. I don't care about how that ends. And we already know the syndicate wins. They keep saying that again and again and again. And you know, it is close.
Well, they lose eventually. They lose it because when we jump in, that first jump.
But we know that Nadia's quest does not work, because if it did work, it would have already worked. Like she's been around enough to know.
Well, hold up.
She's not causing the downfall.
No, she's not, but Tatsuo does. like him going to the Union when they disrupt the meeting after Nadia has been captured, that ends the syndicate, and that causes the Union to become in charge. So when Tatsuo and Nadia accidentally jump to Union territory in the first jump, the Union is in charge now.
Right. So
That's
I
the
guess you
result
can
of-
say,
yeah.
yeah. And he only did, like, he would not have cared enough to do that were it not for Nadia's obsession. And clearly that she was not going to drop this thing.
Yeah.
So there
yeah,
is the causal chain there.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I think all of that's fine. I think I had questions at the end of that issue that were largely answered by the subsequent issue. And I mean, I have more questions about the mechanics of time travel in this universe after, you know, issue 26. So, you know, going out of order, I think issue 28 as a standalone issue or as a finale is like a 3-star out of 5. You know, I'd like it. It did what it needed to do, but it didn't wow me in the process. How about you?
Well, I want to float something to you because my notes have is I have good, not great ending. I felt it read as being kind of rushed, and it may have been. I felt like it was a kind of thing of they maybe saw that the ending was near and they just got to it. Because I think I would have liked. I think I would have liked a little more time with both Nadia as in like vigilante mode,
I would
and
like a whole issue of that.
and Tatsuo like integrated back doing the boring courier work. It felt like I think that of course the downside as I think about it is that leaves more time for again kind of the leadership struggle of the syndicate versus union, things like that. But it felt like to me they got to the end very quickly. We talked last week about how everything was set up that all of our disparate storylines would eventually come together, right?
Right.
And they did. And like, Sebastian, our binary comes back. But like for what? There's no resolution to his story. Like the setup we get with he's doing these jobs to help his sick grandson, who's just like not mentioned anymore, but he's still doing bounty hunter work. And he gets a job from Merv. We got to talk about Merv, who comes out of who
but
comes
Merv
out
is
of
one
nowhere.
of the things that pisses me off. Yeah.
He comes out of nowhere. Well, especially if you read it in this order. Because
Correct.
Merv is a character, a
In 6
reoccurring
or
character
12, yeah.
in 6, 12, and 24. But he kind of comes out of nowhere and is like the most crucial character now all of a sudden. That's why he's a background character, like not even a tertiary character. He's just a background guy who we've seen.
And you think you're gonna see something like they set you up to see like Helgi abuse and torment this guy for years and years and years.
Yeah.
Instead, he's kind of like dismissive when he first meets him.
Yeah.
And then that way with him the rest of his life. And it's
and then we just jump and we see that Fang has been promoted,
Right.
She's now she was Helgi's right-hand man. Now she's Marston's, and Merv is still just like running the warehouse.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're this is why it felt like it was condensed and compacted, and we just got to the end.
To me, it feels like
Yeah.
it was a character-driven story, and Volume 5 was about ending the plot.
Yes, I agree with that entirely, which is why in my mind, if there was one extra volume, like there was 6 volumes of narrative story, and then you do whatever with the interstitials. But if there was another volume where we could have spent more time with the characters and see them progress from the end of 5, we actually get to see Nadia's obsession grow, her time
Sure.
as a vigilante. We get to see Tatsuo like back dealing with the syndicate, like back, I'm assuming like back at the bottom of the rung, dealing with all of this,
there's no good spots in the delivery boy.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But I spending more time with the characters before just like you said, just getting and wrapping up the plot portion. I think that's why
I disagree. I think 29 is the last issue, and even chronologically, you're now following
Oh no, no.
Nadia
I'm
after
sorry.
he's gone, and that's the last chapter of Nadia's events.
And it absolutely is, and that could always be the final issue. But that's not part of the narrative. That's part of the character arc, which I agree it's important. I don't want to dismiss it as not being important. So that's why I wanted to focus on the narrative delivery, which I think was rushed.
Yeah,
Because we didn't get the character time. They kind of hand waved and I think yada yada their way through a little bit of that, a lot of that, and then it ends though. It ends on a really great note, and that final coda issue is I think fantastic, and that could have always been the end, whether it was 29 or 34 or whatever they decided to end up being. That could have totally still worked at the end. I think I just wanted more. I wanted more of the stuff that interests me about the book in the final chapter. And in volume 5, I just don't get that. It's all story and plot and very little character.
well, but you keep talking about issue 29 like it's not part of volume 5.
Well, because I think it
I understand the distinction you're making, but it is part of the volume. The creators grouped it with that in mind as the end.
Yeah, but that is not the end. It's not the end of the events. Like I wanted to see where the characters progress from. Like I wanted to see Jetty readjusting to life outside of Arcola City. You know, when we jump into the future and we see her, she's like total. I mean, she's however long they've been there. We don't know. We know Nadia's been jumping around for a year, so she's aged. But like, I wanted to see what that effect was for someone. Like
I don't
Jetty,
disagree with you on any of that. Yeah. I mean, and I think it seemed to me that when issue 25 was being written and drawn, they didn't know that 29 would be the final one yet, or the or whatever. Because
I disagree entirely.
But they're introducing Merv he's been in the one shots.
That's what I'm saying. He's not being introduced. Yeah.
Well, they're giving him an origin.
Well,
they're saying like, here's the warehouse. He thinks he's going to get promoted.
Yeah.
Helgi walks in. It's like, great. We get more Helgi stuff, even though he's already dead and he no longer has any bearing on the story. So it seemed like they were going backwards to set up, bigger things with more characters. And instead they, felt like kind of the microwaved burrito version of all the characters.
And that's interesting. See, I would the exact opposite way, that they bring him in because he's part of the end game, because they need someone to set up the death of Marston. So they bring in this character who you've seen from the interstitials, as in we're starting. This is the start of the end game now, not the start of expansion. Is that we're bringing this guy in who, if you've been rating publication wise, so I read it as we get to 25 and they know what the end. They know we're coming to the end. There are no more interstitials. We've jumped. We had the last one, which is 24, which is Will Morris's issue, and now here's our last arc, and we're gonna finish our story and then have our coda, which is why I separate 29, because I figure that last issue, as I said, works as the last issue no matter how many issues they go. If the last
no one's on the other side of that issue. They could have gone 100 issues and it would have been 101. It could have gone 12 issues. It would have been 13.
It was always the button. So it was about how much time they spent filling out their narrative plot, the connective tissue from the end of volume 4, when Tatsuo is back in custody of the syndicate, and Nadia and Jetty are about to leave Arcola, the first people to leave Arcola City, when everyone thought that wasn't possible. They sneak out, and when we come back to them, like, Jetty's just adjusted to a new life. She's totally cool with it, and Nadia now is in this obsession.
Well, that doesn't bother me because I never cared about Jetty, and I don't care what happens to her. What I cared about was, why would the Tatsuo's character motivation change so abruptly in volume 5? The whole book, he's being compliant. He's doing this, and this to protect Oscar. And at the end, he's like, oh, sorry if this messes up Oscar, but I got to go do this for Nadia. And you get the answer to that in 29.
Well, I don't know if you get the exact answer to that. I think what you get, though, is he's working on the assumption that they're dead. He doesn't know they jumped back. He has no idea that they left Arcola City, because
But yeah,
his
in a
only
very relatively short manner of time, someone he didn't want to be traveling with, that was handcuffed to in issue 1,
yeah.
is now more important to him than his, lifelong friend Oscar.
Yeah, well, yeah,
But I think once he pieced together, his memories and was like, oh my gosh, uh, you know, not only, the fact that she's still alive means she grows old, which means
so
Natalie,
you read
who I
okay,
met.
so you read 29 as like Tatsuo knew the entire time.
No, I think he figured it out along the way. And I think that's
Oh,
when he
interesting.
was like, I think when that clicked for him, his best friend became Nadia instead of Oscar.
Wow.
Um,
I read 29 is much more ephemeral than that. As that it's that at no point was Tatsuo ever conscious of it, but it was one of those things that's just in the recess of his mind as to maybe why he trusts this person that comes out of nowhere. But at no point does it ever crystallize for him. That's interesting. That's the way that I read it.
yeah. Well, if we get to ask Declan, I'm sure you'll be the correct side of that.
Yeah.
To me, him realizing at some point, like, I wonder if that was Nadia, like seeing me for the last time before she died, even though I didn't know who she was yet. And, she gave me a meal. Like, it would stick out in his memory. They're debating that. And I'm like, no, his job was terrible. His life was awful. Like, having one nice memory and all of that work would most definitely stick out to him. Um, so yeah, I read it that way, and I read that as like he realized somewhere in volume 5, like, oh, she's still alive, which might mean, that person I met is actually her, which is why he begged her to go have a happy life, which she ended up doing. He's like, drop all this stuff with the syndicate, you know, nothing's ever going to bring anyone back. I also thought it was interesting, and I guess this is probably in one of the one shots of volume 6, that the day she stole the time pod was literally like the day her dad died. So it's like she was in an emotional adolescent state from the jump, like when we first meet her.
I think that backstory we get in 12, I think the second one shot.
It's one of those.
Yeah, and I don't think it's the day of, but it's like in the immediate aftermath, though.
Yeah,
like
and you also learn that Tatsuo is the son of her partner, right?
No,
wait, no, of
No.
sorry,
no,
of wait, who was it? I'm trying to remember. That's back in, was that 18 or 12?
no. There's no connection with Tatsuo in there.
Oh wait, he just had his son bloodied up, and I thought it looked like Tatsuo.
No.
Okay.
Well, they draw so that the
I guess his face is so bloodied up I couldn't really tell.
Well, no, her partner is Alex Sanop, and his son is drawn very distinctly. Where, well, yeah. So you see you see the white patch around his eye. When you see him as a child, he has that. That's the
okay. I got you. I got you. I was like, that was a strange connection to just throw in there.
Yeah, no, there's no connection to Tatsuo there.
Good. Okay.
Yeah. So.
But yeah. So anyway, I mean, to me, that was the bearing that 9 had. Plus it had. Okay, so when you were reading 29 for the first time, at what point did you know or suspect that was Nadia, not Natalie? Did you know immediately?
Immediately,
right from the jump. Yeah,
okay. Immediately. Yeah.
Because I thought, you looked at her right away and you're like, oh, that's Nadia. Obviously, young Tatsuo is not going to recognize her.
Yeah.
But I thought, is this a mean trick? I was like, it's so obviously her, and she's given herself a different name. But is this a mean trick from the creators of like, oh, this is just going to remind the reader of, the relationship he has with Nadia, but it's not really her. And then Kevin walks out at the end, and you're like, okay, good.
Yeah, no, it's
not a mean trick, and it was a phenomenal issue.
Yeah, I know. I think it's I do think it's it's curious that we read that entirely differently. Like I said, for me, it left Tatsuo with a sense memory of this person, but at no point was it ever crystallized in his mind. And I think that's probably the more artistic way. And honestly, it never occurred to me that at any point he had that revelation.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Like even looking back on it after reading 29.
again, my question when I was reading 5 was, why did he switch allegiance from Oscar to Nadia? And I guess you could say like, well, Oscar's dead either way,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
might be able to save Nadia, so maybe I should do that instead and say sorry, Oscar.
And and
Um,
and, and
but
that's how I read it. Yeah,
since I went into 29 with that question, I think I found the answer to the question in 29.
that's fair. That's fair. That's
So
fair.
it probably colored my reading more than it should have. But
I mean,
I think it's a cool theory.
hold on. I don't know about should or either way, unless that's the right word or not, because clearly it's meant to be left open ended at 29. Like the whole point is you read into what it
Right.
is. I think my observation was that your read of it was not even one that I even considered. But it that doesn't make it any less valid, because I think you're right. You can take from it looking back, I think, anything you want out of it. But for me, I didn't bump on the fact that in 5, that version of Tatsuo, once he sees Kevin, realizes, hey, there's a chance I can do something about this. Once he finds out that Nadia is alive and realizes there's something he could do about it. Yeah, yeah. Because I don't know. I wonder.
Well, that and
Well,
he did secure Oscar's fate by making sure the syndicate was taken care of. It's
yeah,
like
yeah,
you kill
yeah,
off everybody in the syndicate, they're not going to
yeah,
do that to Oscar.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
And
you could look at it that way too, which I didn't
and
think of till
I will
now.
be honest. I thought we would see Oscar again, and this is part of my idea of like of what was in my mind in terms of why
Well,
it
so
felt
yeah, it
compressed
just like referenced seeing him again.
at the end of Ford, exactly. And it seemed like we would get another version. Well, the older version of Tatsuo and him having a reconnect there. He's on the cover again. If you look at the personnel on the cover that they draw, it's him and Tatsuo again. So I really thought we'd get something there, and it's almost like, yeah, I don't know. I wonder, and this is not text or even subtext or even subtext, but I wonder at some point for Tatsuo if the motivation of Oscar became less important, and he's just like, this is what I'm stuck with, like he's doing it
Yeah.
now, not because, like, yes, Marston makes the threat there, but as we see, so let's think about where we saw him at the end of 4. He was just recently revitalized, so he looked a lot like he did when we saw him in the first book. After X amount of years, and his body is still breaking down, he's still dying. When we see him in volume 5, however long his disease has progressed, like he's obviously getting sicker and sicker. So however long he's been doing this, how long is, it's almost like, if you wrap your mind around the time trial part of it, Oscar's already dead, because the whole idea is that Marston would jump back to the one point before he dies to keep him alive, right?
Right.
So it's kind of a Schrodinger's cat thing, you know?
Well, the whole book is. I mean, if you're
Well,
gonna
yeah,
push it
I'm
like
saying
that.
for Tatsuo, and specifically the way he thinks about Oscar, right? That he is both dead and alive right now in his time, working for the syndicate, because either Oscar has died by the euthanasia pill, or the syndicate has jumped back and prevented that, and something else terrible has happened. I just wonder what the threat of Oscar's, I was going to say his well-being, but like he's obviously closer to death than Tatsuo is at that point, where Marston's jumping in. I wonder how much of that's still hanging over him when we see him in 5. And that's one of those things that I think I would have liked to have seen if the narrative part of the story had been given more breadth for more character stuff. Because that's something for Tatsuo's character that I think would have been beneficial in terms of spending more time with him and his mindset. Just like, as you said, wanted to see more of Nadia as the vigilante. I wanted to see her get more and more
It's
into
just
that.
like, how could you resist the variant cover of like that big assassin suit?
Yeah.
With a one
And
shot.
you mentioned Jetty, and it's not that I cared about Jade as a character, but she is a
She's a
she's
remnant
a
of an equation.
she's a cipher of a character of, not that I care about her and what her experience is. It's just I want to see the experience of someone moving through time and going from what she used to believe and where she lived in that very isolated world of our Coral City to now move with time travel fully, you know, into this new place, and her settling down and Nadia descending into obsession. I wanted to see those kind of dueling mindsets. That's what I wanted to see more of. So it was less that I cared about Jada, because I really don't either. It's more just as a opposing force for what I wanted to see Nadia go through. You know, that they land in this spot that seems relatively calm and maybe relatively peaceful, for one sister to settle down and be like, this is good, and for Nadia to slowly descend into her obsession and madness, and seeing that dichotomy. I wanted to see that juxtaposition in terms of more time with the character. So it's more of why I feel things were rushed at the end, and maybe it wasn't the plan. I don't know. I'm saying I would have liked to have seen that, because it felt like there were chunks of character motivation, mindset that we just
Sure.
didn't get.
I mean, like if the interstitials had been one shot, like asynchronous one shots of more of the core cast rather than these tertiary characters, I
That's
wonder, I wonder if one of the one shots had been Kevin going through all the times trying to find the most robot friendly time. And you just see how he gets treated in every time. And another one would have been Jetty's first week.
That's it. Or Jetty and Nadia, like they're for, that's interesting to see if they use
or Jetty's first week after Nadia leaves. And then she's alone in a new time. Granted, she's lived in 4 times. There's her original time.
Wow, she didn't really live.
She didn't really live. Yeah.
They jumped. They never left the warehouse. They got out of the pod and were So we probably shouldn't count that.
She's been in 4 different times. She's lived in 3.
That's an interesting idea. If they had done that, because obviously being a time travel thing, like the first interstitial could have been just another random delivery that Oscar and Tatsuo made.
Right.
And you could,
or it could have been that one that Oscar referenced in 4. Even though you don't know where it falls on our character's journey,
that's exactly what I was going to say. Is you could show these different parts of their history that then coalesce at the end. That's interesting. So speaking of those one shots at the end, I mean, they're all kind of bummers, right? Like they're all kind of.
Oh yeah, well they're like
they're all kind of none of them are happy. They all end very, very much downers.
Yes. So they reinforced for me, which is like, it's so banal, it's barely worth saying. Syndicate bad.
Yeah.
I feel like that was the message of them all, was Syndicate bad.
Union also bad. Like,
Union also bad.
Yeah.
But Syndicate really cruel and brutal, and they even have a stronghold on the police in every era. And the other takeaway was like, this is the type of thing that would make someone want to leave their time. Not necessarily that things are so bad in their particular moment, but they feel like, oh my gosh, the Syndicate has such a stranglehold on this year. I got to go back somewhere that's like pre-Syndicate. And, there's no such thing. If the Syndicate can deliver you there, then they can reach you there.
Then they're there. Exactly. Yeah. But my note here that I'm curious about is, any 4 of these stories, were there any ideas, storylines, and or characters that you would have rather seen or preferred, or would have liked to have seen integrated into, like, fully into the main narrative and not just give background on things? Because I have one.
I think so. This is like the impossible thing about like the what ifs of it all. Because I think I would have liked to have seen an issue in the first volume with Nadia and her partner before she decides to break away. That way, we know the angle she's coming at. We're not just entering that collision at the machine on Tatsuo's side. We have the perspective of both characters when they meet up. I think that would have been a cool thing. But I also think you might have heard me say something by volume 2 of like, why do we waste all that time with her partner if we're never going to see him again?
Well, so this is so I agree. I think her partner is the one I would have liked to have seen. Um, I don't know if I would have liked to have seen it in that way. Like I like Nadia showing up out of the blue and then you could go back, because I would have liked to have seen what her partner does and how he progresses, because now we know he's under the thumb of the syndicate, and to see him
Oh, that's
woven back
interesting.
into the story. Because what I was thinking was, what if instead of sending Sebastian after them, the syndicate forces
That
Alex
would
to
have
go
been
after them
cool. Yeah.
and says, like, hey, if you do this, you go find them, then you're off the hook now. You know, which obviously would have been a lie because they're organized crime. But what if that was the carrot they dangle, you know, because he's working for them because he knows that sometime in the future they can grab his son and do harm to him. So what if they came to him and been like, hey, hunt down your partner and the person she's with now, you find that, bring him back to us, and then you know what, you're clear. Your son is free and clear. He's all good. You're out now and you're fine. I think that would have been more interesting, because I would have cared about that, because at that point, then theoretically they would have seeded him in and not just the Sebastian character as a bounty hunter, you know, because again, that doesn't end up going anywhere. Um,
Yeah. Aside from, he puts a bullet in the head of another character we don't care about.
well, no, no,
Um,
no, 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 no. What I'm saying is his backstory goes nowhere. Like, why do we spend
oh,
time with
sure.
him being like, he's an ex-soldier and he's doing this, he's getting old and he needs the money because he needs to help his sick grandson? Like, none of that comes to pass. Like none
That's
of that
true.
stuff.
I mean, I think it just
why do we spend
shows.
time? Why do we spend time with that? It shows that again, the world is still terrible and people are stuck in this life. But like, we know that already. So,
No, I
you
think
know,
it showed that, he wasn't just miffed about money like somebody screwed him out of a poker game or something. It was like, hey, I was only taking this crap job to save my grandson. I did the part of the job I could, and you gave me nothing. So now you're dead. There's no more negotiating. I'm not saying it's the strongest, possible version of a story, but I do think it's not pointless.
I don't know. I don't know. I think I'm where you are, of the idea of like, well, why do you spend this time with this guy? Because like, I don't need to know any of his backstory, because he's a bounty hunter. He's getting paid for it. You know, Merv meets with him and says, well, I'll pay you the bounty. And also like, so like what, him having motivation outside of getting paid, like, doesn't matter because we don't see any more with him. So I said, I don't know. I didn't like that. And now that we get to the end, I like those issues less. Or was that 13 and 14 there, the beginning of volume 3? I like that time spent less now. Just because
I think that's a fair thing to say because
nothing comes out of it. Yeah.
I'm like the comp for me is like, you never read the AC Crispin Han Solo books, did you? They're like novels that came out in the 90s.
The novels, no. I've only read very few. I read the original Zahn trilogy in terms of the original expanded universe stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, these books, tell the story of him as an orphan, and then like the very last scene, he's running from the Huts and all these other people and looking for work because he needs to get off planet and he needs money to pay back the Huts. And an old man and a kid walk in with two droids,
Sure. Yeah.
and he's sitting at the table, and you're like, oh, that's so cool. In A New Hope, you don't need that information. All
Yeah.
you need is that he needs the money. He has a ship.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're saying about Sebastian. It's like Sebastian,
Yeah. Yeah.
like in another story, his backstory would matter. In this story, it really doesn't. He's the guy who needs money and he's doing a job.
It could have mattered if they made it matter in the end, because it does matter in the end that Han Solo he's desperate for money because he owes somebody someone, we don't need to know what that is because we find out that that's a thing that hangs over the entire rest of the trilogy. It hangs over through all of 4 and all of Empire,
Right.
So it becomes important. You don't have to know the specifics. All you have to know is he's a smuggler and he's in debt, and there's someone out there who has a bounty on him. So if Sebastian's backstory end up being important, then you look back and be like, okay, that's how we spent this time with him. But it ended up not being important. It just ended up being the guy needs money and Merv pays him money. And he's maybe a little more motivated because this guy didn't pay him, but Merv said he would pay him for the original bounty. So it is like he's not getting screwed out of this. He didn't get screwed from Marston because he eventually gets the money anyway, you know?
Right.
Unless his grandson's already dead from it, which maybe that happens. We don't know. Do you know why? Because he was never mentioned again.
Right.
You know, he wasn't brought up against. Sebastian is still just like, I'm too old for this and I need the money and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, looking back on it, I said, it's why I like those less now. And that seemed more like the kind of thing of, well, if that were one of the interstitial one shots, and we just found out that bounty hunters was something that existed in the world, I might be okay with that. But the fact that he
Right.
ended up being a player, again, I as I'm reading these.
Well, and the
He's in it at
guild
the end.
never comes up in any other context, right?
Exactly. So the idea that there are bounty hunters in this world makes total sense, but they ended up not being important. So why did we spend all that? Why did we spend 2 issues with them when we could have gotten more with the characters that we want? And also knowing that we had these interstitials, you know, if you just want to say that bounty hunters exist, you can do that. And it's that after reading, again, because I had stopped reading the issues monthly at the end of volume 1. So I never got to that, even that first interstitial, the one that Declan drew, issue 6. So I definitely didn't get to any of the other ones. And so the first time I read them was reading them in this order, reading them in volume 6 after the narrative is done. And I found them interesting because I liked that kind of expansion of the world, but none of them seemed critical. And when I read the story of, oh, one of these is Nadia's partner, I thought, well, why not bring in someone with a direct connection like that? You know, because I thought that was an interesting expansion, and that character could have been someone that could have fleshed out the story, because then the bounty hunting becomes personal. You know, if he shows up in some other random time and confronts Tatsuo and Nadia, you know, there's a moment of hesitation there because it's not some random bounty hunter. There's a personal stake there because this is her ex-partner. You know, my mind can't help but go to that spot of like, well, because I feel this other thing was a waste of time, how could it be better spent? And it seems like in my mind, I made the connection of, it could have been better spent with this character that was in this one shot, you know, that I maybe would have wanted more of instead of the character that I ultimately didn't care about at all.
Okay, so my idea for the one shots was to do a deeper dive on non-narrative sensitive things with our main characters.
And I like that idea too. If they'd done that, I like
and
that
yours is
approach.
basically just flip who's in the main story and who's in the one shots.
Yes. If they were going to stick with their current one shot format, that's what I would have liked. But your idea of making them non-continuous, non-critical, but with the same characters in a different time, because then you still could have almost essentially done the same issue 12 with Nadia and Alex. You just jump back to that moment of her leaving. You could have still done that same kind of thing. You know, that could have been one of the time frames, you know?
I mean, I think another cool one would have been, you know, a full issue, you know, at 12 or 18 where you're following, you know, just some syndicate worker just like Tatsuo, and you're like, you know, why do I care that this person can't pay rent? Why do I care that they need money? Why do I care that they need money? And you know, their last job is to like recruit people to go to Arcola, and she's the one who intercepts Nadia's family at the end of the issue. And you get Nadia's family's backstory of how they ended up in Arcola right before we see them arrive in Arcola in the main story, so that we know how her family got there before she even knows.
Before she does. Yeah, that would be good. That's it. I obviously that's a completely different approach to those interstitials, but I like that in terms of a way to a different angle on expanding the universe. You
Sure.
know?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah. I like that. I mean, I'm very
I
much
think it's the
intrigued by
same
that.
character vibe. It's like,
This
is a depressed, oppressed, afflicted person screwing other people in the hopes that they will be slightly less screwed.
Yeah.
Like none of it's great. Like,
Yeah.
you know,
they can still definitely all be downer issues like all of these were, you know, They could all still be just big old bummers about how life sucks and is terrible. It's just a matter of what their angle is to their relationship to the universe, to the story we're telling. You know, if it were a little more direct, like you were saying, I think that would still totally work. And still maybe work better as a volume 6 at the end. Because I don't know how.
I was going to ask what you thought of what's your final assessment of this reading order? I guess we might as well talk about your preferred Star Wars watching order as well.
I don't think I like it, because especially with 24, that Will Morris issue. What did you make of hold on, I have her name here. Verna, the woman who tries to go back in time. She wants to go back a short amount of time because her wife and son are killed in that car accident. And she meets with Merv, and Merv's like, can't do that. A, too close to the present timeline. We can't cross the streams like that. And B, doesn't matter. You can't change the past anyway. Verna goes back anyway. And right before she's about to potentially change the past, she's vaporized. Like the hand of God comes down and stops her from doing that. How did you read that?
That's the thing. I wasn't even sure how to read it. I thought, for lack of better term, I thought someone was functioning as like the TVA, basically. I feel like I was like, are they hinting that there's another organization out there that just polices the timeline? If so, how are they making these arbitrary decisions? Because again, with closed loop.
But so I read it as like the hand of God, that like, no matter what you do, either you're going to go back in time and meet resistance that stops you, or just the timeline stops you. Because in that scene, you know, she's trying to, she has a knife out, right? And she's going to blow the tires of the truck that runs them off the road.
Yeah.
And right as she's about to do that, she explodes. And as that's happening, Merv walks up behind her, like walks up on this like corpse, and he says something like, "Man, told you so," you know? So he's completely unsurprised by what happened, you know?
Yeah.
So which makes me think that like, yes, it's confirmation that it is a closed loop. You can't change things, but what is that entity? Is there some entity that forces it? Or is it just the idea of time that prevents you from changing anything? That if you try to, it's that either you meet resistance you didn't know about, or the timeline is like, no, you're done, you know?
Yeah. Well, that ascribes some type of sentience to the timeline.
Exactly. Yeah. And does that affect then going, because that, when you read it in this order, that's the last issue you read, the last story from this universe. And so is it meant to then reinforce every time someone in what we'll call the main book just harps on the fact that you can't change the past? Is that meant to be confirmation in this reading order? Because obviously if you're reading it during publication order, you read that before you get to the final narrative arc. But by putting it that way, does that change anything? Like, can you put your mind in the idea of, well, if I read this in between volumes 4 and 5, does that change anything about the story for you? I have a hard time. Normally I'm pretty good with that. I have a hard time with this story slotting these in between the various volumes and trying to wrap my mind around how that would change my perception of the story. So normally I'm pretty good about that. I feel I'm pretty good about that. With this comic, I struggle with it. So I'm wondering how you feel about that, is if you can do that in your own mind, place these stories in publication order and think about how it would have affected your reading.
I mean, as I'm thinking about it now, it feels like one of those things that's just meant to spark debate amongst fans, because I think in and of itself, it is relatively neutral and feels like you're going to it's kind of holding a mirror up to the reader. It's like, well, did she, blow up because the timeline literally doesn't allow that, or someone else doesn't allow that? Or was it just a bad coincidence that will reinforce your paranoia about changing the timeline? So, I mean, that's another one I would add to my list of things I would like to ask Declan and Rory, because it's so ambiguous. That being said, I don't think either direction, like, let's say there is some kind of cosmic deity or sentient timeline, and that's the reason you can't change the timeline, does it impact anything else in the entire story? Not really.
Yeah.
As long
Yeah.
as you know it's a closed loop and it's fixed, it doesn't really matter who fixed it.
That, and I think that that's definitely fair. Yeah, that it's closed loop either way, right? It's
Right.
kind of, it's the idea of like, it's kind of like the idea of like, free will versus predetermination. Like if you don't know things are predetermined and you think you're choosing A or B, what's it really matter? You
Right.
know,
Yeah.
if you don't know that things are being controlled or monitored, doesn't make a difference. The end result is the same either way. And I think you're right about that. That whether it's something like the TVA, which I think is a great call out from Marvel and from Loki, someone dictating to make sure things happen, or if it's just the timeline, sentient or not, preventing you, the end result is everything we see is a closed loop. And that's reinforced everything we've seen in the book from this point uh, uh, indicates that it is. Whether or not a character like Stan, who doesn't believe it is, ultimately his actions are such that he doesn't affect the timeline, meaning that everything he did, he was always going to do and always supposed to do. Because he doesn't change anything. Everything still happens, as far as we know, the way they're supposed to, quote unquote, supposed to. So yeah, it's all reinforced of that. As long as there are no contradictions in the book, which there don't appear to be any, then you have to take it at face value that yes, it is a closed loop, and everyone who says that the past can't be changed is telling the truth because it never is changed by
what I
whatever
like
means.
is the book is not about that. I think a lesser
Yeah,
book
definitely not about
would
that.
have
Yeah.
been like, you can't change it, can't change it, can't change it, can't change it. And our main character and finds, one little way to change it. And that's
Yeah.
like their big victory.
Yeah.
And it's like, that would be a victory against the mechanics of the universe.
Yeah.
And that's not what our character's struggling against.
Which I think brings us all the way back to why I felt a little empty on this ending, because I think we've talked about all the previous discussions is that the time travel part of this book is not what the book is really cared about, because they jump through so many times, so many periods, forward and backwards. All you have to really understand is, are they in the past or in the future from the timeline that they know? And the timeline that they leave from, again, is 2140. And that year is not important. Just know that Nadia and Tatsuo come from the same year. And then are we before that or are we after that? And that's all that really matters. Because it's a character book. It's about things they're looking for. For Tatsuo, it seems to be some sort of redemption. For Nadia, it's about her family. We're focused on these characters, and the time travel is just, probably so they can have fun with stuff. We can jump back to the 90s, early 1800s, way in the future, way in the past, things like that. None of that is super critical to the book. And then when we get to the final arc here, it's all plot mechanics, and it's about when characters talk to what characters and when people get information so they can go back. It becomes more plotty and less charactery.
Doesn't it remind you of the last volume of Ex Machina?
A little,
Where
little.
it was like stuff you kind of been dancing around for a long time, you just dump it all out.
We always talk about endings are hard, you know. Ending any story, any serialized story is difficult. And, comics get to a point where sometimes you get to dictate your ending, sometimes you don't. And sometimes you know the end, but it's not the ending maybe you originally wanted, but you're still able to scramble together an ending. And this book kind of feels like that last one, where they kind of knew what the ending was going to be, and maybe they didn't think it was going to end as soon as it did. Because I think when you get to the end of 4, it doesn't feel like you're heading towards the end game. But again, obviously, as we mentioned, if you're reading it now in trade, there's only one book of narrative story left, because the last volume is those interstitials. So if I were reading this as it were coming out month to month in publication order, when I got to the end of what was volume 4 there, which would have been issue 23, I wouldn't have thought that there's only 5 issues left of the narrative. I would have thought there was far more than that, you know?
I agree, and I think Declan and Rory or the two of them together knew that they had an ace in the hole with 29, whatever 29 ended up being, whatever number.
Yeah,
I
as
think they were
the
like,
final issue. Yeah,
this is a very satisfying final issue, no matter when we end it.
no matter
And
if the actual narrative is satisfying, the last issue,
yes,
we know what it's going to be.
and to me, like it took it from a like good, not great ending to like, that last issue. It's a great issue of comics. And I think it bumped the whole thing up quite a bit in my mind. So, uh,
Okay.
can I ask another annoying time question?
Sure.
This is another one. I would be inclined to ask this of Declan and Rory too, because there are a couple. I'm having trouble even putting it to words, but I wrote it down. There is a line in issue 26 where Syndicate sets a trap. Tetsuo finds for Nadia. Tetsuo finds out about it. That's when he decides to act. They send him on another errand, and the guy who sent him says, "Get back here as fast as you can." And I have thought, now why wouldn't he be able to teleport back there to 1 second after he left?
Well,
What is this?
yes.
Get back as fast as you can. Is there some fix is there some type of fixed, like however much time you spend, or even in 29 when he's like, well, I really can't stay, I got to get back. It's like, what would they know if you spend an hour or 3 hours doing this?
No,
as long as you teleport back to the right time.
Yeah, no, I don't think that has any bearing on anything. I think it's just something that people say.
But
I don't think it's meant to have any other meaning than that.
okay. Well, okay. So I thought perhaps the amount of time you took in the place you were affected when you could go back to, or something like it's like, or you're all moving through time together, in which case, when they're, sending messages, like when those union people are just waiting, from January 1st all the way till, midsummer, and they're relaying messages back and forth from the future. People in the future could have, I know the answer you're going to give me is closed loop. People in the future could have watched those messages in reverse order, since they were all there the whole time, and said, hey, July 25th, you sent us a message that she's there, so you guys could just jump to July 25th now, which would undo all of the, sitting around waiting.
Yeah.
But that's the closed loop problem.
Yeah, the answer is the videos don't show up until they jump.
Right. So one last question about this then. What is to stop someone like Tatsuo from going out on a delivery, hiding somewhere with the machine for 60 years, living out a full life, and teleporting right back to the moment before or right after the errand was sent, and he just comes back an old man? It's like, I lived a life. There's nothing you could do to me. Like, I'll keep running errands for you for however long I have left, but I lived my life. Like, they wouldn't be able to notice him, like, hey, Tetsuo's been gone, or he's living in this other time, because he comes back a second later. Like, I think there's some reason you can't come immediately back to right when you left. I don't know what it is, or what, like, and again, the book is not about that at all, but I just can't help it when you do time travel stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. It's the question that pops up for any time travel story. You're right about. I mean, there's that.
But Nadi does it. She burns a whole year of her life, and her Jetty's like, "Wait, how long were you gone?"
Yeah.
Because it was, days or a week or whatever for Jetty.
Yeah, well, she's been jumping all around, and there is that comes up every once in a while, like it comes up in Doctor Who with the companions. They jump and spend all this time and come back, and you realize, yeah, they've aged several years while the people around them have not. There's a funny moment, in Back to the Future, right? When Marty's saving the time machine, he's like, I want to have more time. It's like, wait, I'm in a time machine, all the time I want. And it's like 10 minutes. That should be enough. What the hell, Marty? Really?
Apparently that's all he wanted. Yeah.
But it's the same idea of like, yeah, I can go back to now. Of course, the rules of time travel in that future, they're not working in a closed loop system. So it is slightly different there. So the boring answer, you're right, here is the reason he doesn't do that is because he didn't do it.
Right.
You know, and he hasn't later. So, but no, that is a fair question of it, it's kind of like the eternal time travel loophole, plot hole, you know?
Right.
Not
Well,
loophole,
I mean, that's
plot
always
hole.
the thing
Yeah.
is, yeah.
If you
it's
don't,
like,
if you never address it, if you never address it explicitly and explain why it can or cannot happen, you leave yourself open to that line of questioning. And now, again, the way you said it was, this book's not about that, so they're not worried about that kind of plot hole. But I mean, you're definitely not the only person that's thought of that. You know,
right. Yeah. And I think, the only way around that is, if you don't consider Cursed Child canon, and I kind of don't,
I definitely don't. It's not.
because I was like, I think what was compelling is what was suggested to me with like the Time Turner, which I think, Prisoner of Azkaban is one of the best closed loop time travel stories out
Yes.
there.
Yes.
And it's because you have this Time Turner that has like 12 or 24 hours total on it. And people were like, well, why don't you just spin it and then spin it again and spin it again? It's like, for some reason, it doesn't work like that. You can go back like max 12, 24 hours. Like, they're not going to get into why that doesn't work. But it's like, that's a good closed time travel loop because it can't be abused and magnified.
I think Hermione's can do that. I think the idea that when they go down in book 5, the part of mysteries, and there's a whole bunch of time turners, I think there's a lot of stuff you can go back much further. I think the one that Hermione had, I think, is very specific to it. But no, that's a near perfect example of a closed loop system where the storytelling is all that changes is your perspective. That even though you have gone back in time, the characters don't know that yet until they go back in time and see the same events over again. Cursed Child takes that canon and throws it out the window.
Yeah. By the way, I had a great moment of Inspector Spacetime, for the Community show that Troy and I, it's their Doctor Who.
Yeah.
But my note here in issue 27, I said, everyone is finally in the same place. And then I wrote ... and time. I was like, because it's not really been a matter of whether they're in the same place or not, but whether they're in the same time and place.
And it is, though. That is the first time when they're at the meeting, when Tatsuo brings Kevin and the Union to ambush that meeting, which is the exact time that Nadia, who has just been captured. Yeah, that's the only time when everyone is, again, back in one spot, and if you look at the history of this universe, that's a critical moment because that's when the Union takes over as the crime syndicate du jour, I guess. That's the end of the syndicate and the rise of the Union, which is like at best the secondary plot, that right. I think, again, you and I don't really care about, but is such a large focus in the last part of the book because it's part of the end game of Tatsuo needing to try to save Nadia. He's out of options, so he has to go to enemy my enemy kind of thing.
Yeah, and to be clear, there's a version of this book that could exist where I'm totally wrapped up in the Union versus the Syndicate, but it isn't this book.
I think what is the version of that book? Is that a version of the book where the time travel is actually more critical and the people are less so? Would that be it is?
I mean, I think you could even like Godfather it, where it's just like this massive epic saga, and there are characters you follow and care about, but they're all dispensable. Or more like The Sopranos or something like that, where it felt like there was a core cast of characters in The Sopranos, but as soon as somebody talked to the feds, you take them out on a boat and kill them, and it was like, oh, I thought that was his best friend. Nope, he's gone now.
Well, I mean, it's Tony and Carmela and Dr. Melfi, I guess, like that. Those are your characters there. But yeah, no, I think you're right that there is a version of this book that is not about character. It's basically a time war story because you have the Syndicate in our quote unquote current time and the Union from the future and what their eternal battle is. So there, I think the focus of that story would be on the time travel and the ability and who has it and what you can do with it, and less about character specific journey. You know,
Yes.
I think you are right. There is a version of that book that is not what this book is about. Because I think you and I again are in agreement that anytime we spend with that, uh, the book kind of goes down a notch
Yeah.
in those moments.
Yes.
Yeah.
So anyway, I mean, that is basically all my notes. Like, did you have a ranking for your favorite of the interstitials, or were they all just kind of one thing to you?
Of the in terms of self-contained story, I probably liked 24 the best, the last one, the Will Morris one, just because I think that was the most interesting idea. But in terms of, I think, as I mentioned, because I thought of what it could potentially been more of, that was issue 12, the one that PJ Holden did, which is the one about Nadia's partner in the FBI. I think that had the most interesting potential for the larger universe, but I think 24, the last one, may have been the most interesting to me in a vacuum.
Yes. Okay. I think
Does that make sense?
Yes. Well, I mean, this is no disrespect to anyone else, but I felt like Will Morris's penciling is just a lot more detail oriented than any of the other artists we've encountered in the series. And there was something about it that felt like, oh wow, this is like, it felt the most standalone-ish of all the standalones. And he did a full splash page, which he did the 2-page splash, which we were talking about.
Yeah,
has not really happened in the series.
Mm-hmm.
And prior to that, he did the full page splash in the warehouse, and it just felt bigger and more open, than instead of always being so boxed in like this book has been. And he plays with paneling a little bit. He's got the implicit, 12 panel grid on one page.
Mm-hmm.
And there are, it's, he just does a lot with it. And he's, by his own account on this podcast, he is a slow worker. I'm like, yeah, I could see why this would take some time.
Something you mentioned about the double page splash that I flashed on. I think it's early in issue 25 when we're with Tatsuo as he's kind of back in his routine. There's a double page splash where the panels are read clockwise, where you go around the top, outside, bottom, and work your way back in, which is a storytelling choice that I think jumps out in this book because it's unusual. I think I want to say you're reading narration boxes. Like, I think the other workers are talking about his state of mind, and said the way it is, it circles kind of around, and you get a sense that he's either going around in circles or down the drain or something like that because of the way it goes around. But that kind of storytelling, visual storytelling, is something we see a lot of. We had not seen a lot of in this book, and something that the artist there, Jaffo, clearly decided he wanted to kind of throw in there to mix it up a little bit, so it's not just kind of straight panels.
Yeah, I'm trying to find that. I mean, I'm flipping through all of volume 5, and I'm up to issue 25 or 28 now.
It's like the fourth or fifth page of issue 20 of issue 25.
Let's see, 1, 2, 3.
Maybe it's more like page 10, maybe.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Yeah. You get a long horizontal panel.
Yeah. No, I
top,
did.
And then
I
long
really
vertical on the right hand side, and so you're working your way around. I said that kind of storytelling layout is not something we had seen at all. This idea of changing the panels, changing the direction, changing the order in which you read. That's the kind of thing you see in other types of books, and that is not something that had been brought into this comic. And when you have some of these guest artists that have a different mindset, a different visual flair to them, you can get something like that. And I think we see more of that in those 6 interstitials, in the 6 standalones. You see different level of detail, some different paneling aspects, because those artists are, I'm assuming, intentionally brought in because they bring a different flavor with them. They're throwing at a different speed, have a different kind of repertoire in them. And so they were going for a different feel specifically with those one shots because they knew they only had one issue to go for them. They only had
Right.
one story to tell. So you're bringing in people uh, just to throw change ups because they can.
And it's a very generous thing to do as well. I
Oh,
mean,
definitely, definitely,
it's
definitely.
saying like this has a readership.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. And
but
yeah,
but
I
all of these people deserve to be seen. I
yeah,
mean,
and
I think that's the very cool thing about
yeah,
this book.
I guess I want to make it clear that I'm not knocking the initiative. I like the idea of it. I don't know if the
Sure.
execution was great. There's always a question on that. But the idea of we're going to bring other guest artists in and give them one issue to, because we got these other stories we want to tell as a way to expand the universe. I love that idea. I think it's really, really cool. Um, I'm a little lukewarm on the actual execution there, on what we actually got, but I definitely appreciate the approach and the attempt. I think something like that is really, really cool. Um, Not saying that every book should have something like that, but when you have a naturally expansive world, and when you're dealing with time travel, you obviously have all kinds of things you can go to. So it's naturally expansive. But anytime you have a world like that, and you have extra stories, man, an idea like that is so cool. That idea like that is so cool to me and so exciting. That I would love to see it. I got plenty of books in mind that, man, if they did something like that, every once in a while you just throw a one shot, an isolated story with some side characters and bring in a different artist and let them put their personal touch and flair on this world and these characters.
Yeah.
I think it'd be a cool idea if more series, more creator-owned independent series do that, because it is the kind of thing you naturally see in ongoing long-term superhero comics.
Sure.
You
I
know?
mean, and you get like different variations of it, like in the Black Hammer universe, the alternates universe,
Yeah.
and but that's more like here's a
Here's a
6 issue
four-issue
thing.
miniseries. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Here's a
Yeah.
miniseries, and that idea also cool in terms of how to expand your universe. But something like this here, like if we got our one main story, but we got a bunch of friends you want to work with. Here's how we do it. We get them to get these one-shot issues. I think it's a cool idea. That again, I can think of a handful of books that I would love to see something like that done. Because there is something to be said for your creative team, your co-creators going out there and doing every single issue. Saga, looking at you. But at the same time, like, how cool would Saga be if some of the other artists that Brian K. Vaughan knows and has worked with, if they like, here's one issue of some of these side characters or other parts of the world that aren't directly connected to our main story, and they just got to draw an issue in that world with these characters, and just like, meanwhile, back at the ranch, here's another story, something
Yeah,
like that.
I would love to read a book just about the planet that Lion Cat comes from. Like if there's a
Yeah.
whole colony of lion cats,
Yeah, are there
like
other
why
animals?
aren't they
Who
why aren't they
knows?
and why aren't they governing the universe?
Yeah. So no,
If
yeah.
they just say lying.
So how? Yeah. So how much does it add to the story? I don't know. But I'm not saying I wouldn't want to read it. I'm not saying I wouldn't be interested, because I definitely would be. And I think it's a cool way to try and expand the universe. And so I applaud Declan Shalvey, Roy McConville, and Joe Palmer in that way. Not just for those interstitials, but obviously again using rotating artists throughout the majority of the run, to allow for different artists and different styles and still have it feel cohesive, because you have the same writers in there and you're using the same general aesthetic. And I think a big deal of that, Chris O'Halloran, one colorist. So no matter what the line work is, no matter what the detail is, the color palette stays the same, time and era and all of that. The lettering stays the same. So it's positioning in the panel relative to the art, the characters, all that is consistent. And just what you're getting is a different flavor on the line work. Nothing that's too out of the ordinary and the direction. You can tell it's someone different, but it still feels of the same piece. And I think by just rotating one person out and keeping everything else the same adds to that cohesiveness. It adds to making it feel like it's still all the same story, as opposed to those interstitials feeling completely out of left field, or every new arc feeling completely different from the other. Just by changing out one person and keeping everything else the same makes it all feel of a piece.
Yeah, I agree. I have one last question for you, and this is pure speculation.
Sure.
As you try to imagine a co-writing process,
Mhm.
do you think one writer was more invested in the characters and one was more invested in the plot? Or do you think they both co-conceived of them and took turns writing? Or did they both take a pass at each script? I mean, there's a billion different ways this could work.
In in this case, it feels like this was everything was collaborative. I don't know
Okay.
what that feeling comes from, but for this case, because you're definitely right. There could have been a scenario where um
It's like
one
you write the
writer is right.
syndicate union stuff and
Yeah,
I'll
yeah,
write the
yeah.
characters.
Yeah, and I'm right. Yeah, that there's definitely a world where that exists, and there I can think of books that are like that that are divided in that way, and they totally work because that's the setup from the jump. I get the feel from this that it was they were these ideas came to them together. They worked these ideas and workshopped them, and kind of laid things out collaboratively. Um, that I don't know where that feeling comes from, but just the way that it reads to me, I get that sense, and I have nothing to back that up with other than and
Well, like I said, yeah, there is no data we have to
yeah.
work with here.
So I guess the only way I can back it up is by saying at no point reading it did I feel like there was delineation. So in the absence of that feeling, my assumption is they work together because I would feel like in those books where there are delineations and they are clear, they're obvious and it's noticeable and intentional that you're reading writer A and writer B here. And they melt together and it's one story, but you can see the seams and you're kind of maybe supposed to see them a little bit to know that you're getting different perspectives. I never got that sense from reading this book. So thus, in the absence of evidence, I default into thinking that everything felt that these guys were working together on everything. So
Yeah.
do you feel the
Well,
same way on that? Do you see anything different?
I think I do feel the same way. I will say I wondered if each issue was a little bit of an arm wrestling match, and one of them was like, let's stay focused on, Nadia, Tatsuya, Kevin, our main cast of characters, and the other one was like, oh, we got to build out this mobster world more, and uh, and sometimes Rory won, sometimes Declan won. And I'm not saying who would have written which one, but it did feel like for some of the unevenness and like how much we got stuff we weren't as interested in. Maybe that's just like it could also be that they were too collaborative and you cut the baby in half
Well,
every time.
now that you've brought this up here, something I regret not having paid attention to is the credits page and to see that if it's always credited Declan Shelvey and Roy McConville, or if some of them are credited Roy McConville and Declan Shelvey.
Oh, you mean like each issue?
Each issue,
Yeah, okay.
if there was something like that, if there's any rhyme or reason to that, and maybe there's not. Um,
Yeah, and you'd have to check the single issues.
yeah. I wonder if there's anything about that. Um,
Yeah, because the trades just listed all up front,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so
and
I that is a curious thing of did they switch off the lead on issues, and so the ordering would make sense, if it was Declan Shelvey, then Roy McConville, maybe Declan was in charge of that script, story together, but he wrote that script specifically. And if it was reversed, so not saying that there is meaning to that, but it makes me think that there could have been if I could pay attention to something like that.
yeah. Um,
And again, you're right. It could be that none of this matters to them, that in their mind it's all collaborative and there was no delineation whatsoever. But I wonder if they paid any attention to that and if it had any meaning to them as to whose name came first, when, and for which issues, or if they just switched it up every time, you know?
so with a cursory Google, I think this is probably just inconsistent formatting on the website, mycomicshop.com.
Mhm.
But I was just scrolling through the single issues. But it is interesting that the first time they break formatting for Declan Shelvey and Rory McConville is issue 6. It says Declan Shelvey, comma, Rory McConville. And then for issue 7, it goes back to and.
So that one I could see, only that one specifically because Declan drew that issue.
Right.
So
But
that
I don't
one
know
I
what a
could,
comma would mean instead of an and.
yeah, and
Um,
I could, that is the only one I could totally see in terms of maybe he took the lead on that one because it was his issue, and then obviously, 13 and 14, the mini bounty hunter backstory for Sebastian was solely written by Roy McConville. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know I think that's an unanswerable without being able to speak to them about it. But it's just something that as
oh,
you were
I'm gonna
talking,
bombard Declan next time I see him at a con.
yeah,
We saw him last year that I hadn't finished the series yet. I had
I
him sign a couple issues. Um,
that would be an interesting idea because I think in this case, no, well, my question would be about the credit listing and does that matter? Because I would imagine that this was something that these guys worked on together. Both of them have experience writing comics, so it isn't like they needed to work together on script, on story, and then Declan, the more seasoned writer, then actually wrote the script because that's something that happens a lot with people who maybe aren't in who are working in comics but are still new to them. They collaborate on story, but the actual panel by panel script is written by the person who has more experience. Again, Roy McCullough, these guys have worked in comics, so it isn't like maybe Declan has more publishing experience, but it isn't like McConville is new to this stuff. So I don't think it's a situation like that where one of them was actually responsible for the specific script that went to the artist. But no, I wonder if they had any say or any thoughts on how the credit was listed. Because again, in my mind, it feels like this was something that these guys worked on together. They were throwing in there, and maybe they switched off who actually did the physical typing.
yeah.
Yeah,
Um, or it may have been a consistent process all the way through. Of Rory
yeah,
writes the drafts, Declan polishes them, and
something
they
like
send it
that.
off to
Yeah,
the artist. The last thought I will throw out, and I'm glad you enjoyed issue 24 as much as I did. Declan's cover for 24 is great.
hmm
Will Morris's variant is fantastic.
it's pretty good. It's pretty good.
I've got to track that down, and I don't know if Will's ever going to make it to the States for a con, but I've thought about just sending him a message being like, "Can I just mail you stuff to England? Just have you sign, my Gospel #1, my
He,
before time variant
he might
and
be
your
up for that.
Vertigo quarterly, like just all the Will Morris stuff I have." Just because I'm not going to see him, but I like that's like a hauntingly beautiful, in the artwork and the coloring. It gives me like shades of Norman Rockwell, but with it being such a haunting image of like the children being invisible,
Mhm.
or like washed out of the image while the mom's trying to hug them. Uh, is so much more brutal than Declan's cover, which is just the detective looking over the cliff, seeing the guardrail, like, well, what happened happened. It's a car crash. Um, so both sad and again, just a devastating one shot. All of them were.
Yeah.
Um,
In general, I really do like. Although I guess Declan didn't do a variant for number 6, he did the interiors, but for 12, 18, and 24, they let those artists, PJ Holden, Lauren Knight, and Will Morris, do a variant. And I think in general, those are really, really cool.
yeah,
Yeah.
I've got a few signed variants because there have been, again, they were pretty generous, uh, passing around who got to do variants in the same way they were with, writing and interiors and all kinds of other stuff. It
Mhm.
was just
Yeah,
um,
they bring a lot in
big,
there,
big team.
Yeah, and all of the guest artists when they were brought on, um, I believe they were all given at least one variant cover because Declan did all the covers. They kind of keep the same motif there, but I think all of the subsequent artists after Joe Palmer got at least one variant for their run. And yeah, there's a nice kind of spectrum of artists that they got to do variants for them.
Well, especially
'Cause
when you look at the name of uh, uh yeah, I mean I just looking through the cover gallery in the back of the that's what I do, when I finish the entire series, I go back and
Mhm.
look through all the covers. And um You also try to see like how much did the cover artists know about the plot, you know, when they were given the cover, or did they just read everything up into that issue? So I'm always trying to read into whether it's a cool cover or whether it's telling about the story in any way.
A lot of times I can't imagine they've read anything of the book, you know?
That's true. Yeah, they may just see a character design.
Yeah.
Something like that. So, you know, anyway, the Mike Del Mundo is my favorite cover, which I think was a retail variant for issue 6 with the final record. It's not actually fourth Wally in any way. It's just a really pretty cover.
Yeah. No, they got some really good artists to come in and draw those variants, you know, and they didn't go overboard with them, you know, 2 or 3 for some of the a couple retailer incentive covers, but you know, they didn't go crazy with them. And I think that's, you know, the retail, the variant cover game is a dangerous one for retailers to play and for publishers and creators to get into. But, you know, if you've got some, you know, you call your friends up or you know people, or if you work with people that know other artists that maybe you like and can get a cover from, you know, sure they're not going to say no about that. And there are some very, very cool ones there. So for collectors, I think it's a series that there's a wide spectrum of artists who at least got to just, you know, come in and put a little spin on something just for a cool piece of art.
Yeah. Any other thoughts to wrap us up for the series?
No, I think that's all for me. I think, you know, final thoughts. I think what I said at the beginning, which is this is a good series, and it's a good to very good series with, in my mind, just like a good ending. Overall.
Yeah. And a good ending is not to be underestimated.
I think the last issue is very good, but I do think the final arc, 25 to 28, the last narrative arc for me, landed flat. I think also because volume 4, the stuff on Arcola City, the stuff there was my favorite arc of the series.
I think I have to agree with that.
I think that to me was the most interesting and had the most potential coming out of it. And what we got to me is not what I was anticipating and liking to see. But I do think, again, the last issue, the final moments of issue 29 feels like that was always going to be the last issue, like we said, right? No matter how long the series ran, that was going to be the button at the end. And I think that really works, even if in this case, the couple issues beforehand didn't quite get me to the level that I think I would have liked to have seen.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. You know, I think 3 and 4, which is very rare for me, but the middle of the series was the peak.
I'd agree.
Yeah, I thought it's a little bit of a slow start. Mm-hmm. You know, I think I would encourage someone to read 1 issue into volume 3 before deciding, you know, whether you want to see it through to the end or not. Because I think at that point you would be hooked.
I agree. I think 3 and 4 definitely were the highlights in terms of mix of characters, story, intrigue, all of that. I think that's where this book shines.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I hope everyone reading along enjoyed it. Like I said, you know, go check out that gallery of covers. They're very cool ones to collect. I don't think any of them are like, you know, speculator gold. They're all readily available.
No, I mean, some of the incentive ones. I know there is one for issue 1 by Jean-Paul Leon, who's sadly passed away. I think that might have been like a 1 in 25. So the speculator would be to rarity in terms of just how many copies you could find out in the world. So
sure. But yeah, you know, check them out. I think it's a cool book, you know, to get signed when you go to like cons and stuff like that, especially some of these smaller artists that get featured on this. It's kind of a breakthrough for them. And I will say it was a pleasure to meet Declan last year, and I hope to do it again.
Yeah, no, he's great at cons. Yep.
Established this long list of questions for him. So I'm eager to chat his ear off, and hopefully he doesn't have too long to line. Anyway, thank you for listening. We will see you next week with a new introduction and creator spotlight for a new series to end